You're getting ready for the DLC, aren't you? You little gremlin. I can see you desperately holding on to your rivers of blood. It's a FromSoft DLC. You know it'll be harder than the base game, and that scares you. Now you finally have to learn how to play the game and learn how to dodge and stuff. If only there were a YouTuber who could save you from that kind of responsibility. Hey people, AlphaSeagull here. The man you can trust to tell you the best ways to not play your favorite video games. As much as I enjoy playing them myself, it's not as much as I enjoy breaking them, beyond any hope of repair. Elden Ring is no exception. Buffs are by far the most powerful resources you have in the game. More impactful than any single weapon, offensive spell, attribute, or spirit ash that you have at your disposal. I can make a decent argument that even weapon upgrades aren't as important as a solid buff stacking setup. You've all heard the stereotype of players buffing themselves for 5 minutes up the fog wall, during which any other player would have already beaten the boss in that time. What really happens is the buff setup lasts for maybe 30 seconds at most, and then the boss dies in the next 20, because that's how long the buffs have before they start running out. Real buff stacking setups are usually shorter than they feel, yet still last longer than the fight itself. Some might argue that's a boring way to play, and I understand that perspective. If that's how you feel, I suggest clicking off the video and playing the game normally, I guess. Or, hear me out, use buffs, but not as many. There's a lot of middle ground that the Elden Ring community just pretends doesn't exist. They act like there's no viable or fun way to play the game unless you're either blindfolded with one arm, using a block of cheese as a controller, or you're spamming Comet Azure on every boss. Like, come on guys. Comet Azure isn't even the best one-shotting spell. Anyways, this intro's too long. The point is, I'm here to make you tarnished a little more educated on how buffs work and how to use them. Okay, so what's a buff? Well, for the purposes of this video, anything that gives you some kind of boost not directly reflected as a stat is a buff. And there's quite a few types of them. My last buff video listed 4 categories, but technically they're actually more like 6, since the special buffs from my last video can be split into 3 different things. There's passive buffs, which are active all the time as long as you have the equipment on you and meet the condition of the buff if there is one. A lot of talismans fall into this category, as well as certain weapons and armors. Since they're only active when equipped, you can have at most 11 passive effects at once, if you include your Great Rune. Then we have body buffs, which affect your character's body in some way, right? So most of these are spells and only affect the player, but there are a few exceptions that are either consumables or they affect allies. You can only have one of these active at a time. Next is aura buffs, which always affect both yourself and nearby allies. Keep in mind, not every buff that affects allies is an aura buff though. You're also limited to one of these at a time. Then you got weapon buffs, which, you guessed it, only apply to your weapon. More specifically, direct attacks used by that specific weapon, not any projectiles from your skills, unless that projectile is part of the weapon buff itself, then it applies for some reason. Since you can only have 2 weapons out, you're obviously limited to 2 weapon buffs. Next up you got regen sources, which there's like 4 of them. Fun fact, not everything that gives you regen counts as a regen buffs when it comes to the stacking rules. You can use any one of these 4 buffs, but other things that give regen, use whatever you want. There's not really a limit other than the limits on passives and other stuff. That brings me to my last category, which is active unique buffs. I call them special buffs, but it doesn't really matter what you call them. What matters is these puppies technically have no limit to their stacking. Some of them function by their own rules and limitations, very similar to equipment passives, but the difference is these effects need to be activated somehow, and they don't care if you still have the equipment on when the buffs are active. Well, except for these 2. And even then, I think Sacred Order is supposed to be a weapon buff, but it's bugged to affect everything. Kinda like Royal Knights Resolved used to do in earlier versions, so expect this to possibly change. Thanks to this, you can actually double dip on the bonus undead damage, triple dip when you include Last Rites. And since all the buffs in the game stack multiplicatively, that's 8 times the undead killing power. And you can still stack other stuff onto it. That's how I got that crazy damage at +0 in level 1 that I showed earlier. Without such restrictions, you can get a lot higher. Keep in mind that debuffs are also a thing, which there are 2 kinds. Standard debuffs, which can only have 1 active at a time, and then unique debuffs, which can all stack. Anyways, that's all 8 different kinds of buffs and debuffs, and there's a lot of them in the game. So I don't expect you to memorize all of them, In my last buff guide, I made tables that showed all the buffs and their values, and I've updated those tables for this video with a link in the description with high-res copies. But I'm also working on something a little more interactive. This is an online Elden Ring damage calculator designed specifically for buff stacking. As you can tell by its pristine graphical quality, it's in a very rudimentary early beta state. There's a lot of issues with it, and it's missing a bunch of features and functionality that I plan on adding as I get the time. That said, it does work if you know how to use it.
All of this just works. I'm not kidding.
I have it linked below, and it will contain a link to a separate unlisted video that teaches you how to use it. If you try to use this calculator and don't watch the video first, you probably will mess something up. So don't blame that on me. Right now, it's anything but intuitive to use, but I will eventually fix that and let you guys know when it's finished enough to present in more of an official manner. Anyways, the last buff video showed off an example build that was using a twin blade bleed and frost combo. Now, that video was pretty good back in the day. In fact, it's still pretty good, and you can still use the build today. I would probably make a few tweaks to it, like, because, you know, some balance changes made things a little bit less viable. Like, for example, instead of using bleed and frost, I would probably just use double bleed, double seppuku, because that just works. On top of that, Flame Grant Me Strength became a more viable buff in general, so you can definitely use that as a substitute for Blood Boil Aromatic if you don't want to sacrifice your defense to have better attack, you know? That said, I want to show off a different build today because, you know, I absolutely hate recycling content, which is why it took me so long to make this video in the first place. So I'm going to show you a different build today. It's not really going to be as strong as the double twin blade build that I showed off because that one's just super reliable, but it is going to be pretty strong, so I hope you enjoy. Alright, so it actually took me forever to figure out what buff I wanted to show off today, but I ended up deciding on a Dark Moon Greatsword build that utilizes its weapon buff like to the fullest extent, right? So let's talk about the stats first. The only necessary stats is you want however much endurance it would take to medium roll. You want 20 strength, 14 dex, 33 faith, and at least 28 intelligence, right? Ideally you want 45, but 28 will work. Any amount of vigor will work. Having more just makes you harder to kill, right? So having mind also helps. I just decided 135 was a good level to stop, so I leveled my mind to 21, right? So the important bits here, the only thing that really matters is the fact that we have Darkmoon Greatsword, and then we have Godfrey Icon and Shard of Alexander. And then we have the Spellblade set for at least most of our armor, right? Those are the only, like, super important bits. The White Mask and Lord Blood's Exaltation is only going to last a little while, but it's going to be worth using. So it's not going to, like, make or break your build, but it is helpful to have this, like, more helpful than to not have it, right? And that's what the Blood Short Sword is for, with Seppuku. And then we want any seal that we can use, which we have a lot of seals that we can use right now since we have a lot of faith and intelligence, but, you know, I decided on Frenzy Flame Seal just because it has no requirements and it also weighs nothing, right? And then you want the Jellyfish Shield because this is one of the few weapons that can actually be paired with Jellyfish Shield, and you can use both skills together, right? Now, there's kind of two, it's a bit customizable, right? Because you can have an offensive version and a defensive version. Now, if you want the defensive version, you want to use Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman as well as, or well, you can actually just kind of use any defensive set talisman you want to use. But if you want the offensive version, you can use Magic Scorpion Charm, which will give you 12% more damage, but you have less defense, right? While this one just gives you more defense. Or negation, technically. I mean, defense and negation are two different stats. I just call it defense sometimes just because it's easier to say. And then you want to have boiled crabs in case you're using the defensive version, because there's only one body buff in the game that affects magic damage. So if you're not using the offensive version, which is with Howl of Shibriri as your body buff, then you want to go ahead and use Boiled Crabs, since that will give you even more physical damage negation, right? And then for your physic, you want Magic Shroud and Crack tier and Intelligence not tier. Then for your aura buff, you want to use Golden Vow, right? So you have Golden Vow and Howl of Shibriri. You're going to use Howl of Shibriri and Magic Scorpion Charm if you're using the offensive version, and if you're using the defensive version, you'll want to use either some form of... You will just want to use some form of defensive talisman, as well as Boiled Crabs, right? So that's like generally the equipment that you need. The reason why we're using Spellblade set is because it gives us a buff to our magic skills, which this counts as a magic skill. In fact, it counts when we do the full charge on the R2. While the weapon buff is active, it not only counts as a skill, but also counts as a magic skill, and it counts as a charge skill, which is why we have all of these pieces of equipment here, right? And then everything else is just going to increase our damage further. We got 10% from White Mask, we got 12% from Magic Scorpion Charm, we got 15% from Golden Vow, 25% from Howl of Shibriri, another 20% from Jellyfish Shield, you know, and then 20% more from our flask, right? So when you stack all this together, I haven't done the math on that actually. Hold on, let me check the math. Alright, so all together we get about 4.3 times damage on our skill, right? So whatever damage it was going to do after defense calculation, that ends up getting multiplied by about 4.3, and then that's what we have total in terms of our damage, right? So we are quadrupling our damage just by having all these buffs, right? So let's actually give it a try. I haven't fought... This is my testing save. I haven't fought Castle Soul in the in this playthrough yet. So let me keep in mind this is regular new game, so it's not going to be crazy. But so our order here, since so I'm using the offensive version. What you want to do here is that you want to pop Flask, then Golden Vow. And then you'll want to use your body buff of choice. I'm using Howl of Shibriri here. And then you want to... I like to heal with the flask here, since I don't have too much FP. And then Seppuku. And then you go ahead and use your Moonlight Greatsword buff. And then use Jellyfish buff. And then you should be good to go. So I will see how well that does against this boss. And I'm going to start out fighting these guys. Okay, 5,000. 5,000. Oh. As soon as it actually hits him. There we go. Okay, so that's about 3,000. So my bleed buffs already went away. So they didn't last very long. But if they hit him, they were gonna, you know, deal a pretty decent amount. So let's heal up. And I can refresh my Jellyfish buff. And then, you know, even though I'm using the offensive version of this buff, I can take some hits, right? Alright, I'm actually out on the weapon buffs, so I actually have to swap back. I'll probably go ahead and cast Golden Vow again. Go ahead and heal. Buff. Dodge. Go ahead and buff again. And there we go. Good fight. GG's. First try. I mean, I have fought the boss before, obviously, but, you know, I'm surprised to do that first try, so that's it. If you wanted to do something more reliable, I would probably go for, you know, the defensive version, because this isn't the kind of build where you're going to kill someone in, like, 2 seconds, but it is there. So, you know, the damage was pretty decent. I wasn't struggling really at all in that fight, even though I was using a glass cannon version of that build, right? So that's pretty much it for this video, guys. I'll see you guys later. Make sure to subscribe, hit the bell. Have a good one.